Okay, hi everybody, it's Graham Battison here, and it's time for me to read one of my favourite chapters from herpetological literature. Today I'm going to be reading a chapter from Snakes, the Keeper and the Cat by Carl Kauffeld. Once again we're going back to Kauffeld. The chapter is The Search for Subocularis. I'll get to why I'm reading that chapter shortly. But I think firstly, I'd like to really introduce myself and why I decided to do this series. I really think the current generation, I think we're lacking, you know, we're collecting animals and keeping animals and, you know, and learning things about them online and on the internet and stuff. But I think, you know, the need to read books and the need to read from the people that paved the way before us, I think that's sort of fallen by the wayside a little bit. I think, you know, going back 50-60 years, people were writing things that we're missing and we're not picking up on nowadays. That could really help us, whether it's in herpetology professionally, amateur herpetology, or whether it's in herpetoculture and keeping animals, you know, in caging, indoors, and, you know, out of its natural state. I think there's a lot to be said for books. I think books teach us to to really use our imagination, you know, to really sort of get out there and experience what the writer's going through as they're writing these books. Also, I think I'd like this channel to become a platform for authors who are writing new books to be able to get on and read a chapter from their book. And hopefully we can get them some more sales for the books too. You know, I'm going to be running some regular competitions where I give books away, you know, all funded out of my own pocket. I'd like to inspire some young people to buy books again. I'll buy them books, you know. We're going to be doing things that just really, you know, pins the interest in reading again. And I'd really like to inspire the next generation of young, you know, keen-minded enthusiasts to really start picking up books again and really start using their imaginations again, as opposed to going on an internet forum and, you know, and on Facebook, you know, which, you know, there's a lot of good information on those platforms, but there's also a lot of misinformation that gets spread around. Before I start with the foreword of this book, I'd like to thank the readers that have come and done, you know, volunteered the time before me. So firstly, I'd like to thank Dave Barker. You know, Dave's a good friend, and, you know, his reading really sort of opened the doors for everybody else to start reading these for me. So thank you, Dave. I'd like to thank Scott Eaper, who's a great Aussie bloke. You know, we read a great chapter from a really good book, which I've just ordered myself, The Song of the Snake by Eric Worrell, another older book, but I think Scott shares the same sort of mindset that I do with reading, and, you know, you sort of look up to these people that you're reading about, and, you know, you sort of try and follow in their footsteps a little bit. Craig Trumbauer read an emotional passage from his own book, which, you know, brought me to tears reading it before he ever did his video reading, but again, it brought me to tears again. Myself and my partner both watched it several times now, and Craig's just a wonderful guy and a tremendous ambassador for reptiles and reptile keeping, and just an all-round man of good value. And lastly, I'd like to thank one of my good buddies, Keith McPeak. I think without Keith being present in the reptile hobby, I wouldn't either. Keith really opened everyone's minds and gave them an insight into how to think, how the captive animal thinks. And, you know, Keith's written some really great passages on blood pythons, and not just blood pythons and short tails, but also on the general mind of the keeper. And, you know, he's inspired a bunch of us. He's always had time for us, helped everybody out, and I love him to death, you know. So thanks, Keith. We really appreciate you. Okay. So before I start rambling too much, I'm going to start reading the foreword of this book, and then we're going to go on to the chapter The Search for Subocularis. Okay, so this is Carl Kauffeld, 1969, Snakes, the Keeper and the Kept. A quick fact about this book is my colleague Dennis McGee, good friend of mine from the Hot Springs Reptile Garden, gave Carl Kauffeld the idea for the title The Keeper and the Kept. Dennis worked for Kauffeld at the Staten Island Zoo. He went on several snake hunting trips with him. He was really a mentor to Dennis, and now I'm privileged to be working alongside Dennis and to be really indebted to him, and he's one of my best friends in the world. I love you, Dennis. Thank you. Right, so the foreword. When I wrote my tales of snake hunting in an earlier volume, I tried to include as many details of the natural history of snakes as possible, hoping to instruct the reader unobtrusively while he was being entertained. How successful I may have been in this direction cannot be estimated, but one thing is certain: the book spawned an unprecedented number of snake hunters. Some think this is deplorable, and although it is true that over-collecting and disturbance of habitats may have resulted here and there, I believe the benefits far outweigh the harm done. Some people developed a better understanding and tolerance, if not an actual liking for snakes, but even more have gained a real enthusiasm for snakes and other reptiles, a deep and lasting interest which will make their lives richer, as must any natural history interest. Already, some have become serious students of herpetology, and, together with those less technically involved, form a group which cannot help benefiting the study of herpetology, as well as furthering conservation of reptiles in the wild. Many amateur herpetological societies have sprung up all over the country in recent years, some more scientific than others, but all of them outwardly dedicated to education and conservation. What could be more gratifying than those of us who have helped to popularise herpetology, than to improve the understandings of the reptiles and amphibians, and the snakes in particular? A natural outcome of this stimulus is that many newcomers to the field have a desire to search for snakes in the wild, and to catch and keep certain ones alive. Then too, snakes are offered for sale by animal dealers, and even by pet shops nowadays. These also are a temptation to the fancier. Now there are certain good habits, a certain discipline, necessary in keeping snakes as captives, just there is in collecting them. There is also a need for special knowledge to maintain them successfully in good health. Recognising this need, my publisher and I decided that rather than devote an entire second volume to narratives of snake hunting, we should try and help these new enthusiasts, inform them of the fundamental requirements of how to provide best for snakes as pets, as captives in private collections and in zoos, of the problems that arise and how to deal with them. Certainly the subject warrants a large text which would be valuable as a reference work, but would hardly make good reading. So in order to instruct as painlessly as possible, I've resorted again to story form, and a large part of the present volume is concerned with keeping snakes. The rest consists of further adventures in hunting them. In more than 40 years experience, first as a private fancier, then as a museum and zoo man, I've known literally thousands of live snakes, and, I hope, I've learned a thing or two about their requirements as inmates of cages, at home and in the zoo. I've tried to impart this knowledge by recounting actual experiences, including incidentally as many keeping hints and collected anecdotes as possible. I think the reader can learn more in this way than by wading through a reference book. 2 chapters are concerned almost entirely with methods and techniques of keeping snakes. But for those not especially interested in this adventure, I trust there is still much to hold their attention. Many may be entertained, if nothing else, by the reminiscences of one who has spent his entire life in what most people would consider a very odd pursuit. Then, too, there are 6 more adventures in snake hunting, mostly in regions not covered in snakes and snake hunting. Some of the accounts have appeared before in similar or a condensed version in Staten Island Zoos in Animal Land, and in the Bulletin of the Philadelphia Herpetological Society. I hope that the reader who comes upon any of these a second time will feel that he is renewing acquaintances with an old friend. As always, I strive to fulfill a purpose beyond merely instructing or entertaining. In this instance, I hope to instill good habits and above all a sense of responsibility in the reptile fancier towards the creatures he has taken from their natural environment and deprived of freedom, to help him develop and devotion and empathy towards his charges, to suppress acquisitiveness and the accompanying sin of overburdening his resources of space, time and ability to give proper and generous care. If I succeed in this, I will feel amply rewarded. So that's the foreword of the book. I'm going to head to the chapter now, The Search for Subocularis, which is easily one of my favourite narratives in herpetological literature. I think the reason this is one of my favourites is I've always been fascinated since I was a little kid by the Big Bend National Park region. I read a book on eublepharid geckos when I was must have been 10 years old. I was first getting into leopard geckos, and I didn't realise that there was eublepharid or eyelid geckos in North America. So I had this book and I was reading on the reticulated banded geckos, the Coleonyx reticulatus out there, as well as the you know, the other species of geckos in the area. And Big Bend really stuck out to me. I really hope one day to be able to go out and visit that area, because I think the diversity and just sort of the uniqueness of the flora and fauna out there are something really I look forward to seeing. Also, in this chapter, Kauffeld really sort of recounts his tales with friends he's met along the way. People like William Degenhardt, who's a famous herpetologist. He did a lot of work studying fossorial species. In fact, Degenhardt gave the name to one of my favourites, species from Central America, the Stenorrhina. There's two species in the genus, the scorpion-eating snakes, and one of them is Degenhardti. So, just a little backstory really on, you know, the people in herpetology that sort of come and go, but their names will last forever. And it all comes from a like-mindedness and a common interest, and just sharing tales with other herpers along the way. So here it goes. The Search for Subocularis. If anything could make a snake hater learn respect and admiration for this abused group of animals, it would be the study of their eyes. The writer speaks from personal experience, and that's from Gordon Limwall's The Vertebrate Eye. The flap of my sleeping bag served to keep the blinding bright light of a full moon out of my eyes, and to keep the face warm against the chill night air. Could this be West Texas in August? Only the plaintive call of a whippoorwill in the far distance disturbed the nearly tangible stillness, but I despaired of falling asleep. Throwing back the flap, I devoted myself to a contemplation of the stars, which shone in a cold blue light as on a winter night at home. Here in the Davis Mountains at 6,000 feet in the air, in the clear dry air, no dust or haze softened their brilliance. The Davis Mountains, there was a name to conjure with, a name that had held romantic connotations for me nearly all my life. From a Christmas morning back in the early 20s, when my mother gave me the coveted reptile book of Raymond Ditmars, these mountains had become a symbol, a goal. Turning the section on rat snakes, I had read, the Davis Mountains Colliber subocularis. That was A.E. Brown. From a structural viewpoint alone, this species is very distinct. Between the eye and the lip plates, or upper labials, is a row of several scales. The character at once renders the species unique among North American colibers. Thus far, taken only in the Davis Mountains, southwest of Pecos, Texas, originally described in 1901, less than a dozen specimens exist in collections. Future collectors will probably demonstrate that this snake ranges well into Mexico. I could almost quote the passage verbatim from memory. Here was a challenge. What would I not have given to be one of those future collectors? But many years were to pass before I even glimpsed the Davis Mountains at a distance, and it was not until now, at least 35 years later, that I finally penetrated into them, and I had yet to see alive one of the famous colibers, now called Elaphase subocularis, the trans-Pecos rat snake. Of course, it's now Bogotophis subocularis. As my eyes sought some of the stars and constellations I knew, through the branches of the canyon oaks overhead, I wondered if it was destined for me to find one of these handsome rat snakes. There was no answer in the stars, and certainly what I had seen this afternoon when we drove here to Old Fort Davis and back, a matter of 50 miles or so, was not encouraging. The terrain was so vast and so varied, our time so limited, and my knowledge of the habitat preferences of these snakes so lacking, that I felt overwhelmed by the bewildering possibilities, discouraged by the infinite array of favourable spots offered by this unfamiliar country. Were these snakes of the forested heights, of the canyons, of the juniper-covered slopes, or of the cactus and mesquite flats? So far as I know, no clue was given in literature, although several more have been found since Ditmars wrote one of the first specimens. They had been found south through the Big Bend country and across the Rio Grande in Mexico. But this was no help to me. As I pondered the baffling problem, my family slept in this ranch wagon nearby. We had moved out all of our camping equipment and supplies. We had made sleeping arrangements for my wife and 2 boys inside. Suddenly my cogitations in the stillness were shattered by the rattling of one of our empty water pails. Instantly I thought of the skunks and raccoons who visited us so boldly during the evening, and I knew that somehow my precautions in hiding and covering all exposed foodstuffs had failed somewhere. I reached for my flashlight, and immediately its beam shone fully on a big handsome raccoon not 5 feet from me, with some large red object in its mouth. In surprise he dropped it, and I knew what it was when I heard the squishy thud. Until then I had forgotten the fine tomatoes we had brought with us from Missouri in the pail. In sullen resentment the coon stood for a moment and muttered in his throat, but soon turned and stalked away, a strategic withdrawal rather than a retreat. I followed him with my light to the base of a nearby tree, where he busied himself with some matter understood only by coons. Slipping out of my sack I made a survey of damage. 3 tomatoes had been pilfered but not carried away. They lay on the ground where they fell, and I left them as tribute to our four-legged robbers, and hid the balance in the pail, in a place where even a raccoon could not reach them. Several more coons and skunks appeared in the beam of my light as it shone about, but they were too bold to show any signs of alarm. Thoroughly chilled by now, I returned to my warm sleeping bag. The temperature was to drop to 50 degrees by morning. The poor will had ceased calling, silence prevailed once more, and I soon fell asleep. It seemed like no time at all before the first daylight wakened me, and sounds from the wagon announced that the boys, chronic early risers, were stirring. By the time we had our simple breakfast and repacked all the camping equipment, the sun was already burning hot, and I scanned the sky for clouds, but nothing marred the uninterrupted blue overhead. In Arizona, cooling afternoon storms in the altitudes of midsummer often brought out reptiles that otherwise would lie hidden in deep crannies and holes, and I hoped that similar weather would bring like results here. But the fact that we were on the other side of the divide, and that West Texas had been suffering severe drought, lent little to support such hopes. It was still too early to tell, but it seemed highly unlikely that we would have rain at any time. A Texas spiny lizard, the first sign of reptile life we've seen, scurried around the oak tree under which I had slept. Together, Ricky and I managed to confuse the lizard enough to make a successful grab, but not before we caused him to lose his tail, which now lay twitching on the ground. Not to be taken by the saurian ruse, we persisted in our pursuit of the tail's owner, but after establishing his identity we released him to finish out his life on the oak tree and to grow another tail. Because we intended to travel south into Big Bend country and the Quizos Mountains, I decided we might as well continue southward and make a reconnaissance of the entire region, possibly returning later to the Davis Mountains if nothing more interesting diverted us. Except for 1 or 2 sorties up rock-strewn juniper-covered hillsides, we made no stops. The only reptiles we saw were a single Big Bend tree lizard and a freshly killed black-tailed rattlesnake in the road opposite Olympia Canyon. This was encouraging, for as much as I might deplore not having been the one to come upon this snake while it was still alive, it was an indication of the presence of these rattlers in the area. My road casualty, characteristically greenish, as are all the black-tailed rattlers in Texas, quite different from the golden yellow ones I had known in the Huachucas of Arizona. Twisting and winding, curve upon curve, the road dipped and turned and climbed again, following its course of least resistance through the rugged topography of these majestic mountains. Canyons below us, peaks above us, and in front of us displayed every variety of rock formation and plant growth. Transition timber in the forested heights appeared as dark green streaks and patches. Numerous shrubs, acacias, mimosas and mesquite have the advantage here of more abundant rainfall than the lower altitudes. Outside of the mountains, mesquite barely ever reached the dignity of the tree, and often dwarfed to a mere shrub, is still the only available timber over thousands of square miles. Over much of the arid and semi-arid portions of Texas, it provides fuel, fence posts and building material. The feathery foliage, so thin that grass could grow underneath, affords scant but welcome shade. The fragrant flowers blossom quickly, and in warm weather after a good rain, a crop of long bean pods matures and ripens with little regard to season. Often 2 crops a year mature. If rains come at proper intervals, the sugary pods can be used to fatten cattle, but this use by the Indians and early settlers seems to have been abandoned. Widely staggered junipers covered the stony slopes. Here and there a recognised old acquaintance, the agaves that lifted tall flower stalks 10 or 12 feet above their thick fleshy leaf bases. These are century plants, the mezcal of the Mescalado Apaches. They grow over the barest, roughest slopes and yield a rich store of food in the starchy cortex. It is said that the beautiful flowers contain a quantity of delicious nectar equalled by few other plants. A single plant during its flowering period of about a month bears from 1 to 2,000 flowers, each yielding nearly half a teaspoonful of nectar. Everywhere in the distant differences in vegetation are the indicators of the amount of rainfall, the vital factor that is responsible for the radical and abrupt changes we see in both plant and animal life everywhere in the southwest. Although the highest peaks receive the lion's share of meagre rain, they are far from being lush. But as we looked up now to the forests atop Livermore Peak, about 8,000 feet, I remembered that it had now been reported that quaking aspens, trees of the Canadian zone, glow along the northwest base of a cliff near the peak. Always such trees indicate exceptionally cool and moist conditions for the latitude. As our eyes drunk in the grandeur of the mountains, my thoughts were kept returning to the question, where in all this splendour would my coveted Subocularis choose to make its home? It seemed I was strict on my own, and that only repeated trial and error would bring the answer to this riddle. I surmised that wood canyons would be the most likely niche for them. In my experience, the rat snakes as a group were snakes of more or less forested areas. I was to discover ultimately how wrong I was and how futile such theorising can be. So often the animal turns up in the most improbable and almost unbelievable situations. With rat snakes, the almost completely absent west of the continental divide and dwindling to 1 or 2 species of the western edge of the Great Plains, it would seem they are essentially snakes of the eastern forests, and at the western periphery of their range they would also seek the trees. However, much this might restrict them. My conjectures on this perplexing problem ended when I became aware that we were definitely losing altitude. Although there were still heights around us, each time the road rose and fell, it did not rise again as it had earlier. We had dropped down into Fort Davis, a sprawling little town of about 1,000 inhabitants which owes its existence to the old fort, which is now a ruin of red adobe buildings. Once an outpost on the overland trail, Fort Davis protected Presidio and its environs from the depredations of Apaches and Comanches. Nestling against a rocky hill, it's easy to picture this installation as a busy military post it was when first established in 1854. It was named after Jefferson Davis, US Secretary of War and later President of the Confederacy. Of the many buildings still standing, there is one which the Apache girl died of wounds sustained when she was shot by sentries as she came at night to warn the fort of an impending attack by Comanches and Apaches. Happily for the fort, she was able to tell her message before she died. The next day the Indians were completely robbed of the advantage of surprise. The soldiers prepared for the attack successfully repulsed them, though they numbered over 1,000. One wonders what strange influences led this girl to betray her own people to the hated White Eyes at the cost of her own life. Still, an outpost, Fort Davis, is one such I would like to live in, were I free to make a choice. Besides its own charm, it has the advantage of a naturalist being relatively close to the fascinating regions. The Davis Mountains to the north, Arizona and New Mexico not too far to the west, Big Bend country and the old Mexico to the south and west. It was towards the Big Bend and the Quezos Mountains over 100 miles away that we now turned our wheels. I had some misgivings about the pronounced drop in altitude and the character of the country. This was becoming decidedly desert and the altitude could now be no more than 3,000 feet. This would certainly be no Subocularis here, according to my theory. We reached Alpine near midday. The sun, burning, blistering hot, shone mercilessly down on the hard-baked flats. Occasionally fleecy clouds out to the east threw shadows on the ground which did little or nothing to relieve the dry heat that blew in on us as if from a blast furnace. While we continued southward, the shimmering mirage never ceased to dance across the road in front of us, producing the familiar illusion of a wet surface. I question whether any rain would ever turn that illusion into reality. The clouds that continued to drift across overhead were not the thunderheads of the Huachucas. These were dry weather clouds, clouds that promised no moisture, or at least none that would ever reach this parched earth. An occasional buzzard perched upon a fence post surveyed the austere landscape in a fashion that made familiar by cartoonists who wished to convey the despair of utter desolation. Ocotillo, yucca and prickly pear cactus had become the dominant growth. This was the Chihuahuan Desert, Lower Sonoran life zone with a vengeance. What life? The ignorant would ask, but we know that the desert has its own forms of both plant and animal life, often in astonishing abundance and diversity. At midday, when the sun beats down unremittingly, hardly a creature except a vulture dares venture from cover. But when it sinks in the west and the blessed darkness relieves the heat of day, life will spill forth from the thousands of subterranean burrows, and the desert floor will witness such activity as is impossible during the day. Only we human beings defy the discomforts in the tradition of mad dogs and Englishmen, as we hasten on with the typical curiosity of mankind to see what lies beyond. Although there have been high buttes here and there extending their flat tops considerable distance and jagged peaks just visible at the horizon, the terrain had become relatively flat and unchanging. Now, however, it became more rolling and more rugged. The land was cut by arroyos and barrancas, washes and draws, bluffs and rocky eminences were increasing. The road dipped and rose, and distant mountain ridges were coming closer. These are typical badlands, fantastic and majestic in their beauty, reminding one of the scenes artists depict as existing on the moon. The craters of the moon, possibly, there are like these eroded rock formations, yet the vegetation, the mesquite and thorn bushes, the prickly pear and ocotillo is sufficient evidence that this is not really a lifeless waste. If we have the patience to seek them, form upon the form of the varied life of the desert will be revealed to us. I was reminded of what Dr. John Van Dyke says, that the desert differs from any other land in the matter of water, lack of it. Consider that West Texas receives less than 10 inches of rain a year. If southern France should receive no more than 2 inches of rain a year for 20 years, it would, at the end of that time, look very much like the Sahara Desert. If the Adirondack region of New York were comparatively rainless for the same length of time, we should have something like the Mojave Desert, with the Hudson changed into the red Colorado. The conformation of the lands is not greatly different, but their surface appearances are as unlike as it is possible to imagine, and the charm of the one is just as undeniable as that of the other. Any moving object in this austere land attracts immediate scrutiny. There was a vulture to our right flying rather low, but there was something about it in flight that seemed not quite right for a buzzard. And then I noticed that this bird, unlike any buzzard, had distinct white bars across its broad tail. Although it was at some distance, it seemed like the head was feathered, not naked as with the vultures. It occurred to me that this must be a zone-tailed hawk, one of the large hawks of the Buteo group, and I thought how some of my birdwatcher friends would envy me this sight. Apparently the bird was undismayed by the heat and expected to find some unwary prey as it soared over the mesa. We were gaining altitude, and looming purple in the distance directly ahead of us were the Quizos. Those mountains that rise in rugged peaks to nearly 8,000 feet in the heart of the Big Bend country, now one of our fine national parks. This is where the Rio Grande dips low into Mexico, flowing southeast from El Paso. It then turns and flows northeast to form a southward bulge in our international boundary. By travelling east, southwest at this point, one inevitably comes to the banks of the Rio and Old Mexico. This almost bisects precisely the northern half and broadest part of the Chihuahuan Desert. We were well within the boundaries of the Big Bend National Park and approaching the first ranger station. Knowing that I would have to return to the headquarters to fill out the papers for permission to hunt reptiles, I stopped and obtained directions. The polite and intelligent young man stationed here was doubtful of our finding accommodations either in the campgrounds or cabins of the Quizos basins. Because it is not permitted to camp just anywhere, I was somewhat puzzled as to how or where we could set up a base. By a great stroke of luck, my fears were unnecessary. However, similarly, in a very pessimistic frame of mind, I opened the screen door to enter the park headquarters. To my utter amazement, I bumped into an old friend, Bill Dagenhart, a young biology instructor at Texas A&M. Simultaneously, we both voiced the inane question, "What are you doing here?" Although Bill seemed exceptionally pleased at the encounter, he could not have been as happy as I, for, aside from my high personal regard for him, I felt he would probably have some solution for our dilemma. He seemed happy that I was there with my family, remarkable in a bachelor, for usually unattached males resent intrusions on their sacrosanct privacy, but not so Bill. Without the slightest hesitation, he offered to quarter us at the biological station at Grapevine Springs, where he assured me he and his 2 associates had ample room for us. Bill was working partly on a survey of the reptile and amphibian fauna of Big Bend National Park, and partly on a population study of lizards within a measured acre of desert floor. Here he set traps, flat, box-like affairs, with one side funneling into the dark interior. When these are laid on the ground and covered with loose soil, the lizards are inclined to run into them to gain shelter from the sun. Once through the narrow end of the funnel, they cannot find their way out. The operator examines his traps twice a day, removes his catch, marks them by clipping toes, notes the number if already marked, and releases them. Over the course of months, not only can a good sample of the population within the area be obtained, but movements from one place to another can be traced quite accurately. A young mammologist, Norrell Wallace, worked trap lines, making a survey of the small mammal population of the region. Assistant Bill and Norrell was Ernst Tanzer, a competent and enthusiastic high school student from College Station. They were a highly congenial trio, and we felt honoured by their hospitality and very comfortable in their company. Bill soon introduced me to all the pleasant folk at park headquarters, kindly jovial Superintendent George Miller, a serious, well-informed park naturalist Haddock Broderick, and later that magnetic person, Ranger Earl Steele. Earl is especially well acquainted with the reptiles and is deeply interested in them, as he is all wildlife, a prerequisite of all good naturalists. In the hands of such splendid people, our stay in Big Bend could not be anything but pleasant, and if it weren't productive as the snakes I had hoped for, would be no fault of theirs. Sitting in Broderick's air-conditioned office, I was asked what I expected to accomplish during my visit. I replied that although I hadn't set any special goals, I hadn't set my hopes too high. I would be overjoyed if I could find just one Subocularis, a Trans-Pecos rat snake. "They're common," snorted Bill. "We have 5 or 6 back at Grapevine now, and we ought to be able to pick up a couple for you on the roads at night." Far from being disillusioned about the rarity of Subocularis, I was delighted to learn that they were not so much rare as restricted in range, and that my good fortune had extended to finding the very person who knew where to find them. Now if you want to look for something really rare, try for a lyre snake. I've been lucky enough to get two, one of them right in the yard at Grapevine, Bill added, and I knew this was no idle boast. Bill is modest and soft-spoken, but the note of pride in his voice was unmistakable and justified. He had secured the 6th and 7th specimen known of this great rarity. Originally described in 1886 from the vicinity of Chihuahua, Mexico, the Texas lyre snake, Trimorphodon wilkinsoni, a mildly poisonous, rear-fanged snake, had remained obscure for all these years, and up to 1940 was still known from only 3 specimens. It is isolated from its relatives in Arizona and California, and differs in the distinctive separated light-edged blotches. The lyre-shaped head markings, being absent, are only faintly indicated by 3 dark spots. I felt very privileged later when I held one in my hand, a true herpetological gem. Finally we took leave of the kind people at the park headquarters, and it developed upon Ernst Tanzer to go out with us and guide to the Grapevine Springs station. The 8-mile drive was partly on hard surface road which led away from the Quizos into the desert, and our surrounding remained characteristically deserts, with extensive patches of Lechugia agave being their dominant growth. This plant, so typical of the Chihuahuan desert, was one I had not seen in quantity since I had been in Mexico years before. Like all the agaves, the Lechugia stands up, a tall flower stalk from a base of densely packed fleshy leaves that radiate from the centre. Its rigid leaves are about a foot long, well armed with hooks along their edges and a stout spine at their tips. These afford abundant protection against grazing animals and man, and one soon learns to step wide of them. They grow in the greatest abundance over limestone and lava mesas and on steep rocky slopes. One of the plants that appeared now in the thickened chaparral was the purple-tinged prickly pear, a large flat-leaved cactus-like its common green relatives, but exhibiting a remarkable violet hue. I was informed later that this is a distinct species which was entirely new to me. After dropping down almost to Tornillo Creek, we turned sharp left at the pavement and into a deep-rutted sand road that followed a wash, undulated through barrancas, dipped into dry arroyos, and out again in a perfectly confusing fashion. Obviously every small topographical advantage had been considered in establishing the intricate trail. Ernest regaled us by pointing out locations where they had made outstanding catches, a black-tailed rattler here and a leopard lizard there. Just after an abrupt rise we turned sharp right, and suddenly we were in a compound with several adobe houses and outbuildings and a windmill water pump. Although we had rarely dropped 400 feet in altitude, we seemed to be on a high point, 3,300 feet to be exact, overlooking the Tornillo Flats to the east with the Sierra del Carmen range in the far distance. At our back and to the west and south were some hills which were shut off any view there might have been of the main peaks of the Quizos. The main house at Grapevine, which had been a sheep rancher's abode in days gone by, was turned over to Texas A&M by the National Park authorities for a biological station. Built of adobe outside and plastered walls within, it was covered by a roof of corrugated iron. Although the sun beat down on it all day, it was remarkably cool. Our adobe hacienda had 4 large rooms. One of them was the kitchen, boasting not only a gas range and running water, but even an electric refrigerator. Besides storing food, this had become the repository for a number of dead snakes placed within there, with a view to injecting them later, but decomposition had won over refrigeration with devastating effects on one's olfaction each time the door was opened. So that must have smelled. Each of the other rooms had fireplaces, which there was certainly no need just then. All were electrically lighted. More than all of these conveniences, I think, were appreciated most the small shower house that stood a few feet across from the yard. Its blessings were difficult to overestimate, even through a swarm of paper hornets stood in rows under the eaves where they were nesting, and I glared and glared down balefully at us each time anyone took a shower. So far as I know, no one was ever stung, but the range was extremely close and care had to be taken not to stretch an arm too far into their direction or swing clothing about too wildly. Although we never encountered any, scorpions were fairly common indoors and out. Bill told us that one evening they saw the diamondback rattler crawl unconcernedly across the compound and disappear into a chaparral on the other side. The house had been constructed with a corridor running through its centre. There were doors to the outside, and each end in typical Mexican fashion, and each of the 4 rooms opened onto it, providing cross ventilation. The kitchen had an additional door opening into the yard. The same corridor had been converted into a workshop by the biologists who had stacked their bottles and jars of preserved specimens. There were tables with books and instruments for injecting and skinning. There were cages, boxes and equipment of every kind. Most interesting to me were the cages of living reptiles. There were Texas alligator lizards, several black-tailed rattlesnakes, including a brood of 6 newborn young, western diamondback rattlers, Mojave rattlers, and a number of the remarkable mottled rock rattlers of the Quizos, which often display a pinkish or reddish suffusion, apparently correlated with the reddish rocks among which they live. There were bull snakes and night snakes, the 2 Texas lyre snakes mentioned before, and most amazing to me, 4 or 5 trans-Pecos rat snakes. The very snakes I'd hoped so fervently to find here in the Big Bend or in the Davis Mountains. Ernest acquainted us with the various features of our new surroundings and helped us move in bedding and other essentials. We were happy to find that we could repay in part the kindness shown by augmenting the camp food stocks with our own supplies. Aside from bread, sugar and milk, which we were able to buy at the park commissary, the nearest grocer was over 70 miles away. Subsequently, like 2 conspirators, Pauline and Bill took over the planning of menus and the preparation of meals, stretching supplies by utilising and combining some likely and unlikely items in order to feed 7 people every day. I watched the culinary machinations with great interest. It must be admitted that they managed extremely well, although the friole appeared with a frequency hardly outdone in a Mexican household. Left to ourselves for a while, we prepared and ate our evening meal and hurried outside to watch the sunset. In the east, a haze of dust hung over the jagged peaks of the Sierra del Carmen, yet the sun struck tints of rose, scarlet and purple from their treeless slopes and crags. Dust devils like whirling dervishes swirled across the burning desert flats. Little canyon bats, pipistrelles and the darker big-eared or parrot bats, impatient for darkness, fluttered around the camp in astonishing numbers, flying so close they could almost be seized in the hand. In broad daylight, hours before dusk, dozens of these winged little gargoyles would begin their fascinating aerial acrobatics, dipping and swooping with such abandon that one felt they must crash, but it never happened. Ricky and Noddle each, on 1 or 2 occasions, were able to catch these bats in a butterfly net, much to their astonishment. Darkness came on rapidly, and in the heavenly stillness, we watched Mars begin to glow redly in the east. We watched the moon rise, we watched the bright star disappear gradually behind the peak in the west, and I tried to explain to Ricky and Jack the illusion of rising and setting of the moon, sun and stars caused by the Earth's own rotation. I don't know how much of all of this they understood, but the astronomy lesson came to an end when Pauline heard a slight rustling in the bush behind the kitchen. Shining one of our flashlights in the direction of the sound, we picked up Susie LaPoo, a female skunk, a habitué of the camp which the biologist almost adopted as a mascot. Sooner than I dared hope, Bill and Ernest returned to Grapevine, their hosts having released them early in view of their newly acquired social responsibilities, and as I'd half expected, they suggested some road cruising. It was about 9 o'clock, as early as anything would be moving. The road must have time to cool, yet not cool too much. The temperature was a comfortable 86 degrees Fahrenheit, with the 2 biologists on the front seat next to me, snake hooks and flashlights ready for action. And with my wife and the boys in the back, I drove the wagon out to the black hardtop road that led away from Tornillo Creek. 6 pairs of eyes scanned the road surface, edges and shoulders, hopefully. I hardly expected the road to be crawling with snakes. It would take one, only one, to make me completely happy. But it's always encouraging to see some activity, even if it is only for reassurance. The presence of any snake is always reasonable evidence of the presence of others. But there was little such reassurance this night. Certainly their food was here in abundance. Our headlights shone on many pocket mice and kangaroo rats as they scurried across the road. Jackrabbits loped in front of us along the sides, or just sat and watched us as we passed. The much scarcer and much fleeter desert cottontail could be recognised by his rapid gait, swift as light, by comparison with the slow lumbering pace of the antelope jackrabbit. A great horned owl peered at us from a mesquite bush close to the edge of the road, and disdained to take flight until I had brought the car almost to a complete halt. There was no lack of life, but although these mammalogical and ornithological apparitions were not devoid of interest, I would have preferred to see more reptile life. This was not destined to be a very productive night. It was not until we had been out for nearly an hour and travelled a good many miles that we saw anything at all. It was Ernest who drew first blood, a night snake, Hypsiglena, the first and only reptile we saw. It was a really good spotting, for these snakes are quite small and by no means conspicuous. They are probably the most frequently encountered snake on roads at night in the southwest. Certainly I was not much impressed by the fruitfulness of road cruising in the Big Bend. By comparison with my experience elsewhere, see the AO Road in Snakes and Snake Hunting, this was remarkably poor. But Bill had picked up many of his best finds this way, and he assured me that Subocularis was not to be found by any other means. No matter how difficult it was for me to reconcile this desert habitat with rat snakes of any kind, I had no alternative but to take his word for it. It happened that the second, third and even the fourth night produced nothing spectacular, and nothing to bear out Bill's contentions. I never once doubted that our much sought for Subocularis must be here, but they weren't showing for us. This unaccountable perversity of creatures is a familiar phenomenon, and merely reflects our own ignorance of the factors influencing their movements. There is no question that chance plays an important role, yet bad luck alone does not explain the absence or seeming absence of certain animals from accustomed spots. After considering obvious factors such as temperature, humidity and wind, there is yet some detail which we fail to take into account. I am inclined to believe that the poor results of our first 4 nights could have been attributed to bright moonlight. It's an inexplicable fact that a brilliantly bright moon is usually unfavourable for road hunting for snakes, and they sense that better illumination makes them more conspicuous to their enemies, which include owls, skunks and the like. It's not known, but one thing is certain: they are conspicuous by their absence on such nights. Mammals continued to intrude themselves upon us. Mule deer were seen frequently. A badger shambled off the road in front of us one evening. Another time we seen a beautiful pair of desert foxes, a pale large-eared species sometimes called the kif fox. Most interesting to me was the first hog-nosed skunk I had ever seen, a form in which is immediately and conspicuously different from the common striped skunk, so familiar to everyone. The hog-nosed skunk deviates from the rule of common colour to most animals, dark above, light below, and instead is pure white over its whole upper half from the top of the head to the tip of the tail, with the lower half, sides, legs and face is black. This reversal of colour and general appearance of the animal give it a striking resemblance to the honey rattle of Africa, to which it is no way related. The honey rattle is a notorious slayer of snakes, and it's probable that the hog-nosed skunk is an important enemy of snakes too. Time is running out rapidly. That our visit had been enjoyable could not be denied, but it was a sharp disappointment to me that snakes continued to be so elusive. The biological station was to be closed by the last day of August. It was with heavy hearts that we helped pack up most of the equipment and load it onto the station's 2-panel trucks, which Norrell and Ernest were going to drive back to the college. It was after dark when we bade Ernest, the last to leave, a safe journey. By 9:15, we ourselves were headed out towards the hard top, hoping that concentration on the road would be an antidote to our sad thoughts. There were some notable differences in this fifth night. The moon would not rise until 1 o'clock, a favourable circumstance in itself, but more difficult to evaluate where the temperature which held high into the high 80s and a hot dry wind blowing without interruption, a sirocco of the mesa carrying dust and even sand. I had some misgivings about the high wind, for it can be decidedly inimical to snake hunting. As usual, we saw nothing on the sandy stretch of Camp Road, and it was with keener anticipation that I swung off onto the black surface of the paved road. Almost immediately we came across a rattlesnake lying stretched out, squarely in the middle. Jumping out with a sack, a hook and a clamp stick, Bill and I prepared to bag our first A-class snake. It was a diamondback, about 3 feet long, but at the time we were quite certain it was a Mojave. Certain identification was not always easy in the light of a headlamp or flashlight. We had little difficulty deciding on a procedure, and the snake did not help matters, attempting vigorously to crawl off the road. It was hooked back before it got too far, but it seemed we might spend the night there as we didn't act decisively. The wind blew so violently that we could not hold the bag open, and it would have been dangerous for one person to hold the bag while the other hooked the snake in. Such an operation would have lent additional meaning to the expression holding the bag. We could have pinned down the snake's head and picked it up by hand, but I preferred to avoid this. It did not take us long to decide that the best procedure would be to lay the bag on the road and hold it open to the wind with the jaws of the clamp stick. This worked with signal success, for the sack bellied out, leaving a good wide opening into which the snake was guided by the hook with no difficulty at all. Thus the manoeuvre was completely safely and without undue strain on the snake, an aspect that the right-minded hunter must take into consideration when catching highly nervous animals such as rattlesnakes. After this initial success and welcome diversion, we continued on our way with lighter hearts. The omen was good. It would seem that the desert diamondback is not to be deterred from a nocturnal ramble by a high wind. Having climbed now to about 3,700 feet elevation, we began gradually to slope off towards Mexico. The temperature increasing, the wind abating not at all. We came upon a DOR rattlesnake and stopped by to examine it. If it had been anything but a western diamondback, Bill might have considered it worth preserving, but it was not too badly mutilated. Deciding it was worthless, we tossed it into the brush well off the road. This is significant since Ranger Earl Steele had passed this way earlier in the evening on his way to Mexico and noticed the dead rattler. Returning after us later that night, he missed the DOR and began to ponder on the power of tequila, which instead of causing imaginary snakes to appear, made real snakes disappear. Whatever doubts he may have had concerning his sobriety or keenness of observation was set at rest next day when we told him the dead snake's true fate. Besides a night snake which had just ingested an enormous meal, which we can assume was a full-grown Texas earless lizard, we did come upon another rattlesnake, this time an alive on the road diamondback. We were still under the impression that the first rattler had been a Mojave, a much rarer snake here. In fact, until Bill had caught his first Mojave rattler the year before, this species was definitely not known to occur in the Big Bend. All 3 rattlesnakes we had seen on this night were western diamondbacks, but the following night on the same stretch of road we did finally catch a genuine Mojave. Although these two are well differentiated snakes, they bear a superficial resemblance to one another. The immediate difference is the relative width of the black and white rings on the tail. The black rings in the Mojave are much narrower than in the diamondback. Approaching the point where the paving sands and the road changed to cracked rock, the most difficult of all surfaces on which to recognise snakes at night, we turned around and headed back. We cruised at about 20 miles per hour, and it seemed we had been driving interminably without seeing anything. It was nearly 11 o'clock. We were less than 2 miles from the intersection of the road to Tornillo Creek when suddenly there it was, a snake crawling at the edge of the road. We all saw it at once, and I knew without Bill's almost too casual announcement, Subocularis, that was what it must be. I slammed on the brakes and was out of the car in a flash, but Bill was quicker, and because it was on his side of the road, he had it in his hands before I rounded out the front of the car. One must act with dispatch. A moment's hesitation and the snake might have crawled irretrievably into one of the chaparral. Automatically handed the precious beast to me, unconsciously a concession to my enthusiasm and inexperience. His attitude, that being that of one of whom this was an old story, and seemingly half amused at my delight in our find. It was a young snake, 38 inches long, showing no resentment at being picked up so suddenly and held in the glare of the headlights. It crawled calmly through my fingers and made no special attempt to escape or to bite. My first examination was perfunctory. I merely assured myself that it was indeed Subocularis, and that lovingly placed it in a bag and put it away in a collection box. Not that could be any question of its identity. There is no other snake in that region that bears the slightest resemblance to it, and besides, there was the distinctive scales under the eye to which Subocularis gave its name. It seemed we should hurry on to see whether any others were abroad, although for me there was hardly anything further we could look for or wish for. It's difficult to explain the joy I felt when I held that snake. How can I make clear to an inexperienced person what this moment meant to me? Beyond the fact that it was a realization of a boyhood dream, beyond the fact that I had finally found the snake alive on its own native heath. Until a few days ago I had never seen a Subocularis except as a pickle in the American Museum study collection. Almost more important to me than all of this was the exquisite beauty of the animal itself. Years later I still marvel at and revel in the delicacy of the lines, colour and pattern whenever I look at it. No doubt aesthetic appreciation of snakes is the result of long conditioning, yet many of my non-herpetological friends agree with me and seem to understand my enthusiasm for this creature. Perhaps they are only being kind, humouring my eccentricity, but to me, insignificant as this individual snake is amongst myriad animal forms, infinitesimal as we all are in the universe as a whole, it represents beauty and perfection, fashioned by loving hands, as one would say, a work of art. Nothing further was revealed to us on the roads that night, and I was glad when we got back to the station I was able to look at our Subocularis more closely. Happily our snake had not a single scar or blemish, and it appeared to be a female. But for the rest, I am at a loss to describe it adequately. First, Subocularis is relatively slender, even more slender it seems to me than other members of the genus Elaphai. The head is long, flattened, quite distinct from the neck. The snout is truncate and slightly but delicately swollen in the nostrils. The tongue is a deep pink, almost a red, lighter at the tips of the fork. The eyes are remarkably large, somewhat protruding, turned slightly forward and upward, capable of a degree of movement unusual in snakes. In fact, the eye of Subocularis appears to have become specialised for nocturnality. Aside from its size, the pupil dilates enormously and contracts to a very small opening. At its maximum dilation it seems to be slightly oval, but not perfectly round as in other rat snakes. The iris is light grey, but a golden corona surrounds the pupil, often appearing metallic and giving a gilded effect. Subocularis eyes have been reported to display a distinct eye shine, but I believe this is due to their bulbous quality, which causes light to be reflected from the outer convexity, particularly when light is thrown on them from an angle. I've noticed this myself when light is directed from, in front, or even across the head. A true eye shine is light reflected from within the eye, directly through the pupil, and can be seen fleetingly in any snake if the light happens to strike into the eye. The precise reason and mechanics of eye shine in snakes is not known because they lack the tapetum lucidum, the layer of hyaline cells behind the retina, which produces eye shine in other animals. Our snake's head is a soft fawn colour, without markings, but with a violet gloss like a mourning dove's back. At times it displays a bluish sheen, almost as iridescent as a morpho's wings. The lower lip and chin are white. The ground colour of the body is also a rich fawn tan, like the head, although it may be quite orangish in some specimens. A series of 24 wide-stemmed H's starting as 2 sooty black parallel lines on the neck with 6 connecting crossbars form a ladder-like pattern down the back. These H's remain distinct almost at the tip of the tail on our snake, but in some way they become mere spots. Their colour varies from dark brown to black, nearly purple in some, but the crossbars consist of black edged tan scales a little darker in shade than the ground colour. The wider part of the paired stems on either side of the blotch encloses 3 to 6 white edged scales at its centre. Where the H's become separate blotches distinct from the parallel lines of the neck and foreparts of the body, they are connected by poorly defined stripes of russet or henna red, thus maintaining parallel lines down the back. On the sides, indistinct, wavy, vertical blotches or bars of grey appear, one alternating, one more or less corresponding with each of the dorsal blotches. On the neck of these are indicated by thin horizontal pen mark streaks. The underside of the singularly beautiful snake is immaculate, oyster white, as opalescent of mother of pearl, and the whole animal has a soft velvety texture to the touch, which gives it the artificial, the unreal quality, which is a fascinating peculiarity of most reptiles. Many of them seem almost man-made, even their movements are often machine-like, and they appear to be manufactured of materials, metals, plastics, enamels, porcelain, rather than living cells and tissue. The symmetry of scale shapes and patterns they form, the colours of which often produce mosaic effects, all contribute to this impression. Yet nature reserves the right to be inconsistent, for rarely, if ever, does one find a snake with perfectly symmetrical pattern. Almost always there is asymmetrical portions that save it from the absolute uniformity that characterises man's machine-made designs. The following morning dawned with its usual heat and brilliance. From the kitchen door I watched an early roadrunner dash through the yard. Dangling from its beak was a lizard which had been either too early or too late. We dawdled over endless cups of coffee, justifying our idleness with consoling thought that no reptile worth having would be out in this heat. It is one of the problems of desert hunting that after being out late at night it is difficult to arise with the sun and the next morning in time to see the forms that enjoy a few hours of daytime activity and then must retire into their burrows before they perish in the heat's early onslaught. The curtailment of the hunter's daytime activity in midsummer at least makes for sociability, although we may feel occasional twinges of conscience for this seemingly wasted time. Stepping out into the broiling sun and glancing at the thermometer is all it takes to convince him of the futility of even the most desultory hunting. A pause in our conversation enabled us to hear the pair of motors speed somewhere on the road into Grapevine. In the middle of the morning, this is sufficiently remarkable to arouse interest. Bill even ventured to guess that it was one of the Rangers' cars and not one of the road crew's trucks. We hadn't long to wait. The dust cloud, which always marks the progress of a moving vehicle in these parts, came closer and closer. Very soon a black sedan spun into the compound. It was Harold Broderick, the dapper park naturalist, who stepped out, looking neat and cool as always despite the hot ride into our camp. After exchanging greetings he reached into the car and pulled out a gallon-sized jar which contained a magnificent Subocularis. It appeared an exact duplicate of our cat's the night before, but so much larger I had to concede ours seemed almost insignificant. We'd all moved into the kitchen where the sun's restless rays would not distress the prize, where we could examine it at leisure. The snake was not at all disconcerted by our stares and seemed to sense the security of the jar despite its transparency, for it made no effort to crawl out even when we laid the jar on its side with the top open. The mouth was too small to admit a hand, and it appeared we would have to wait until the beast came out of its own accord. My patience being short-lived, I soon hit upon a scheme which I thought would induce it to leave the jar promptly. Finding a corrugated cardboard box of appropriate size, I cut a hole with my penknife at one of the short ends to fit it over the top of the jar. With the box inverted, this offered a dark retreat into which any normal snake would retire with alacrity. I was somewhat chagrined when the Subocularis made no escape, no attempt to crawl from the jar into the box, even after making a tentative move forward to the opening. Either it was too much interested in us, or was not a normal snake. So we sat around the kitchen table, baffled and defeated. Meanwhile, Harold told us the story of its capture. Ale Steele, driving with a guest back from Mexico late that night before, passed by one Subocularis, giving in to his companion's reluctance to share the inside of the car with the snake. But when he saw another Subocularis, he stopped, despite his friend's protest, saying Carl would never forgive me if I passed up this one, and neither would I have, for it was a superb brute. Harold handed me a neatly printed slip from Ale, giving the precise time and place at which he picked up this animal. Fancy my astonishment when, comparing my notes on the snake we had found, I discovered that the new one was from only 1/10 of a mile beyond, and was caught exactly half an hour later. This must be the heart within the heart of Subocularis country. Again my patience had lived out its brief span, and another idea occurred to me which I was certain would drive the new snake out of its voluntary glass prison. Picking up the jar and box, I carried them outside and placed them in the direct sun. In a matter of seconds the jar became untenable, and our Subocularis whisked into the darkness of the box. A moment after I turned it over, I had him in my hands and carried him into the house. How handsome he was, and what impressive size. We stretched him out as best we could and managed to get a fairly accurate snout to tail tip measurement. He was slightly more than 4 feet 10 inches long, by no means a monster, but almost 20 inches longer than the first one. Like all of these of his kind I have seen, this snake was gentle and never offered to bite. Now I had 2 fine examples to take back with me to the zoo. Towards late afternoon, storm clouds began to gather over the Sierra del Carmen, and it appeared we might have rain by evening. A scrub jay and a mockingbird hovered about and kept watch on me as I botanized to the east of the compound. Familiarizing myself with details of the chaparral, like the big opuntias, creosote bush, cat claw, the fantastically exaggerated old thorn, and the dark green tough little guayacan plants that had solved the tremendous problem of eking an existence out in this viciously inhospitable soil. A fine growth of opuntia immediately opposite the kitchen door was heavy with a full ripe fruit. The prickly pears, which are highly succulent and edible when the spines are burned off. Braving the spines, I plucked about a dozen and half large red pears, and taking them into the kitchen, singed off the spines by holding them over a gas flame with forceps. I found them quite delectable. The slight acid tang and almost blood red juice gave them an exotic character which I alone seemed sufficiently depraved to appreciate. No one was especially interested, so I finished by eating them all, wishing that I had lived permanently in a place where I could pluck prickly pears in my backyard. The rain was steady and not so violent as the mountain storms that I had known in Arizona. Before reaching our own area, we could see the light downpours here and there round about us, but not until the lightning flashes and thunderclaps heralded their arrival did any reach us, and even then the rain fell with reluctance. The first big drops kicked up small dust clouds and pitted the ground like rifle bullets. Apparently the bats were inactivated by rain, but I was amazed to see the numbers of hawk moths trying to get in through the screens at the light which shone at our windows, not at all dismayed by the unaccustomed drenching. My old love of the sphigids led me to make a closer examination of these insects. I was not at all astonished to find that all of them were the white-lined morning sphinx, the same hawk moth I'd known since my boyhood in parks around Philadelphia, where they came to the phlox and petunias at dusk. The same that I saw again darting in their long proboscides into mimosa blossoms in a backyard in St. Louis. Dozens of them I had watched in broad daylight at evening primroses in front of a ranch house too, Huachucas, Arizona. And here they were in Big Bend too. Truly this is beautiful and amazingly hardy and widely distributed bug. Their large powerful bodies are banded and striped brown and white. Their long narrow upper wings are brown, striped with buff or white, and with an especially broad light band running diagonally across the wing from its base to the upper tip. The lower wings are small, rounded and deep rose red in their colour. Their flight is powerful and darting, exactly like that of a hummingbird. They do not rest on a flower, but hover in front of it with wings beating so rapidly as to be merely a blur, while the long proboscids dip deep into the corolla to suck the nutritious nectar that sustains life in these wraith-like creatures. The downpour ceased after less than an hour. With darkness fully descended, we hastened out to the paved roads to see what might have been tempted abroad by the cooling moisture. They were disappointingly barren. Aside from some red-spotted toads and the Mojave rattlesnake alluded to before, nothing appeared, but it was the next night, our last, which was to bring triumphant conclusion. Again, the night's hunting was prefaced by even heavier rains than the evening before, because of the accelerated cooling which would obscure the early activity of reptile life. It would be well to make an earlier start. With the air temperature now at a low 82 degrees, we set out a little before 8 o'clock. From our vantage point at Grapevine, we had seen that the rains were heavy in the vicinity of Tornillo Creek and the highway. We thought it advisable to use Bill's lighter station wagon for deep water stands in the lower part of the camp road after these flash storms. We were just congratulating ourselves on nearly reaching the paved road without encountering much water when a pond-like expanse greeted our eyes. Covering the last 50 yards or so of our path before the abrupt rise to the crown of the road was water of unknown depth, and since it was quite certain that the loose soil it was covered was mud. Since Pauline and I were the heaviest occupants of the car, we decided to get out and wade, leaving Bill and the boys to take the vehicle through. With just a little slipping and sliding and hardly any hesitation, they managed to gain to the crown of the road without submerging more than about a foot at most. But although we picked our way on the highest spots we could find, we sank in and slipped on the grease-like adobe which had been dust a few hours before. By the time we reached the car, each of us had what seemed like several pounds of mud adhering to our feet, which rapidly hardened and threatened to cake our feet permanently in adobe bricks. Bill and I had agreed on tactics since this evening that were a departure from the usual road cruising. Since we had pinpointed the occurrence of the Subocularis to a relatively small area, it seemed wise to drive to the precise point where we and L. Steele had found our snakes, and proceeded there on foot. Possibly we could find snakes that would never appear on the road or before they reached to it, and it would give us an opportunity to explore the huge culverts of which all good roads in the southwest are underlaid to carry the floodwaters from the flash storms. These pipes form a natural passage for animals to funnel into. Leaving Pauline and the boys in the car, we started walking one on either side of the road. We wove back and forth through the patches of prickly pear cactus and lechuguilla, around yuccas, ocotillo and mesquites, over the stony ground and up dry washes and down arroyos, into the culvert pipes and out again, but nothing stirred. It confirmed again what had been impressed on me and was thoroughly established by now, that the plant association of the Subocularis habitat was typically Chihuahuan desert, Lower Sonoran, with lechuguilla the dominant growth. How strange that seemed to me, and still does. Meanwhile, Bill had gained the road again and was following its edge. Just as I was climbing out of a gully, I saw his light dip as he reached down for something, and as he straightened up I could see the dim light from his headlamp that he held a large snake in his hands. It was at his side, in a flash, another Subocularis, and a big one. As large, if not larger than nails, and exceptionally yellow. He was just disappearing into the brush, crawling off the road. I was just about able to make him out, Bill explained. So it seemed that the road still held its irresistible attractions, and that one had better stay with it rather than spread out into the surrounding brush. One thing was certain: we would not find that snake if we had not gone afoot. We had failed to bring a bag, so with the snake writhing in my hands and over my arms and shoulders, we continued to walk along the edges of the road, but we saw nothing more. After we had covered quite a stretch, Pauline drove the car up to us and we cruised for another half hour or so. This was to be our last snake, a fitting climax on this last night on our search for Subocularis. The stars were shining brilliantly, and some coyotes sang us a song of farewell at Grapevine that night. However, reluctantly we left this enchanting spot at dawn, this place that we had come to love so quickly as a home. For me at least, any sadness was assuaged by the deep satisfaction of realizing a dream. I had 3 splendid Subocularis to take back with me. I had seen their home and learned much. What more could I ask? After nearly 10 years, the first Subocularis rat snake we caught is still alive and thriving, and most probably represents a longevity record for the species. The second snake and the one caught by Earl Steele were placed on exhibition in the Staten Island Zoo, and the other I kept at home. In late fall of that year we had a serious failure of our heating system in the zoo, which could have accounted for the death of these 2 snakes soon after. But the one I had at home continued to thrive in its thermostatically heated cage. Eventually it too was taken to the zoo, where it is to be seen to this day. This snake fed almost entirely on newborn or very young mice. Very rarely would it take a fully herd, half grown or larger. The babies were taken dead or alive. No attempt was made to constrict it alive. If alive, they were engulfed while struggling, but even a pre-killed large mouse would be seized and constricted vigorously if the snake happened to be in the mood for larger prey. More often it insisted on pinkies, having the exasperating habit of nudging these with its snout and rolling them about the floor of the cage until I thought it would never make up its mind to take them. It was not unusual for it to take 6 or 7 at a meal. Some observers report that this species shows a distinct preference for very young rats. This may very well be, but on my own experience provides no conclusive evidence of this. In December of 1957, Bill Degenhardt presented us a newly hatched Subocularis, one of 3 that had been hatched from a clutch of 4 laid by one of his captive females. Without a doubt the first eggs and young known of this species. The tiny snake was with us only a short time when it disappeared very mysteriously from its cage behind the scenes in our reptile house. It was assumed that it had been taken by some visiting snake fancier who thought he would appreciate it more than we, but to our amazement it turned up one night over 9 months later. It was frightfully emaciated, for it is extremely doubtful it could have had anything to eat during all of that time. We had little hope of helping the snake to regain the lost ground, but again to our amazement it took food voraciously, digested successfully, grew rapidly to adult size, and is today a large and healthy example of its kind. Amazing. Most often when snakes have been reduced to such a low ebb as this, they are incapable of assimilating food when it finally does become available. The Trans-Pecos rat snake, Elaphas subocularis, is remarkable in that it seems to be the specific host for a tick named Apanoma elaphensis. The subject of a very interesting paper by Bill Degenhardt, now Dr. Degenhardt of the University of New Mexico. Evidently the snakes receive very little harm from these parasites, but they do frequently lose the tips of their tails for a very interesting associated circumstance. Lesions created by the sucking mouthparts of ticks attached to the tail will damage the tissue enough to cause it to slough off the tip. Ordinarily, where tail tips are missing in snakes, it is frequently the case with water snakes and king snakes. It is assumed that the result of narrow escape from some predator that has seized the tail and has bitten off a piece, or the snake may have torn away leaving a bit of its tail, or perhaps pinched it in some time between the rocks. The amazing number of these snakes that lack tail tips, altogether with the fact that tick encrusted tails have been observed, seems to account for this mutilation quite logically. As would be expected in our captive race hatchling Subocularis has a perfect tail, but the wild caught companion specimen that has lived so long almost characteristically is missing the tip of its tail, and thereby most certainly hangs as tail. So that was the chapter, The Search for Subocularis. Snakes, The Keeper in the Cap, Carl Kauffeld, 1969 book. I hope everybody enjoyed it. I hope that sort of took you on a tale across the Big Bend and the scenery that Carl encountered, you know, along his way, and really sort of, you know, lit the fire of excitement within you that it did me when I first read this chapter, of just really taking the time and effort to get out there and finding a snake that you really want to see, and eventually you're rewarded with finding it in the wild in its natural state, you know, not kept in captivity, and you can see where it occurs amongst the other plants and animals. Fingers crossed one day I'm going to make it to Big Bend National Park, and hopefully I can take my family with me and recount this story, because it really does stick out in my mind, as do many of the stories from Big Bend National Park. But I hope everybody enjoyed that, and again, enjoy the channel. If there's any criticism or ideas, you know, I'm all ears to hear them. We do have some interesting guests lined up to come on. Bill Love has volunteered his time to read from his own book, which will be great. Also Mark O'Shea is going to read a story for us, and we're very blessed that Dennis McGee is going to read one of his favourite chapters. So stay tuned guys, it's all to come, and thanks for watching, really appreciate it. Signing out, thank you.